Mm, well, mm.
Hey, Kenny, we're recording.
Oh God.
Okay, so let's get back into it. Um, so I talked about every type of masking except for amplitude-based masking in that example of the vocal. Now I'm going to talk about I'm going to show an example of amplitude-based masking. So um, this example features all of the guitars and all of the vocals during the chorus. I use compression on the guitars as a group to get them out of the way of the vocals. By using a medium attack and release, I'm shaping the waveform to slightly tame the onsets of the notes and have the compressor stay active during the sustain portions. This way the guitars don't overpower the vocals. So this one is without the compression on the guitars, and then I'll immediately after play the one with the compression. I didn't love you. I didn't love you. Why do I still cry? I didn't. Are you guys hearing anything right now or no?
No.
Not
Okay.
currently.
It just like once the video stopped rendering, it just like got out of the presentation for some reason. But I'll just play I'll play the uncompressed version again, and then I'll play the compressed version.
Yes, sir.
I didn't love you. I didn't love you. Why do I still cry? I didn't love you. I didn't love you. Why do I still cry? So basically, what I'm doing is turning it down, turning the guitars down only when they reach a certain threshold of amplitude. So instead of just taking the entire guitar bus and turning it down by a few dB, I'm doing compression to kind of ride that gain a little bit and setting it in a way that I listen to it with the vocals and make sure that they get out of the way of the vocals. And you can look at the settings on here. Very low ratio. So I'm really, because I'm affecting multiple guitars, I really just want it to be something that just kisses it just a little bit. And the attack is a medium attack and medium release. Yeah, so it's just kind of barely affecting it, but it really gives that sort of like ducking out of the way a little bit without the ducking artifacts too much, and just ducking out of the way enough of the vocals to kind of like let them shine through more, because the vocals are the center point of this piece. So now we're going to talk about another example of frequency-based masking, and this is something I do on almost every synth bass that I get, depending on what it is low pass filter it. And we were talking earlier about how lower frequencies in general have a wider spread of masking than higher frequencies. And this synth bass you're going to hear in a second just doesn't have a lot of high frequency information, so I wanted to get rid of it. On something like a bass guitar, you might not want to do this because there actually is a lot of like high, mid, highs, like frequency information on the onset of each note. So you don't necessarily want to get rid of that on a bass guitar, but on a synth bass where the onset is really like a long attack time, like it's okay to do something like this. So this is I want you to pay attention to the synth bass. The synth bass is what I'm changing, but you'll also hear the kick in there as well. So I want you to hear how the synth bass gets out of the way of the kick on the second example. So for me, it's even more obvious when it's in the full context of the mix, but I wanted to show it with just one other instrument to make the effect a little bit more obvious as far as like what I'm actually doing. But this is one way, especially if the synth bass was louder than it is. It's a way to get it out of the way of all those guitars and vocals, because it's a common problem that synth basses eat up a lot of the frequency information in those like mids, upper mids, and stuff like that. So yeah, so this is another example I'm about to play of time-based masking. This is a specific example of a kick. So I added pre-reverb to the kick, and this example features the kick and the guitars. By putting pre-reverb on the kick, the low frequencies seem more pronounced because of the onset of the kick is lasting a little bit longer. Time-based masking affects drums because in general their sustain lasts such a short amount of time compared to melodic instruments. So using plate reverb and either pre or post masking is an essential tool in unmasking percussion. So for me, it just has a little bit more thump because it has a little bit of a longer onset to the note. So you're hearing that low end just a little bit more. And the last example I'm going to play is an example of timbre, and this one's really cool because it's an obvious use of a flanger instead of the subtle one we were looking at earlier with the chorus on the vocal. This one is on the melody. I called it melody guitar. It's the melodic guitar that plays at the beginning. It's a clean guitar, and it plays it in conjunction with the main rhythm guitar. Um, and it's 100% wet. It's not running in parallel. It's running in series, so it's really obvious. I'll play it without and then with. Yeah, so that one, for me, I really notice it because one of them is modulating and one of them is not. And when something is modulating, we naturally pay attention to moving stimuli more than static stimuli. So it also just separates it timbrally from the other guitar. And for me, it really is obvious when they're playing like the same notes, but you can hear the flanged guitar more than, or you can hear them as separate things rather. Whereas for me, at least in the first example, you could hear the clean guitar once it got up into the more higher range of its playing, but at the beginning, it got lost in that other guitar. So I just did this to separate them. Um, if you're working with a client, this is something that you make sure they're okay with before you do, because this is actually like changing the timbre of the instrument. It's not as subtle of a thing. So you have to make sure they're okay with it. But if they're okay with it, then it's a really good way to unmask something. So yeah, that's basically it. So let's talk about um, there are three primary types of masking. There's amplitude-based masking. It can be overcome with compression to shape the waveform or fader moves. There's frequency-based masking, which can be overcome with EQ, but is ideally solved during the arranging process. Sometimes an arrangement can't, you get a mix and you can't necessarily solve it in the arrangement. That's when EQ is a really, really good tool to solve frequency-based masking issues with complementary EQ, like low-pass filtering, stuff like that. Um, there's also time-based masking, which can be overcome with a plate reverb or backwards plate reverb. The reason why I'm using a plate reverb for unmasking specifically instead of something like a hall reverb is because we just want to make that note last just a little bit longer, or the onset of the note be a little bit longer. We can also add, it's a really common technique to also add hall reverbs in conjunction with plate reverbs to make it so that you're getting that like reverberant space effect, but you're also getting that unmasking effect of the plate reverb. And you can really experiment with different delay times on the plate reverb to get it to a sweet spot where it's not too obvious, but it's something where you can really hear the instrument more readily. Um, so yeah, then there's a couple of other ways to release from masking. There's space or location. You can use the pan pot to separate instruments from each other. That's something I did that I didn't really touch on here. In the final mix versus the initial mix. The initial mix, everything was pan dead center. I actually made it mono. So it was just pan dead center, everything was there. A lot of the release from masking happened because I panned things out. And that took care of a lot of it. I had to do these techniques to further that exploration, but panning the guitars out, panning some of the vocals out, stuff like that, putting them in different locations, we just perceive them as being different instruments. They don't fuse together like they would normally. And then there's timbre as a release from masking. Separating instruments through timbre by using a modulation effect can release from masking due to our natural ability to focus on stimuli that are changing over static objects. Now I'm going to play the whole thing, the unmasked version, and I want to see if you guys can hear any of the techniques that I've talked about through this. There's something that you might not necessarily like hear on a first listen, but hopefully after like talking about them, you might be able to pick some of them out. Wait, alone, I ask you why. Wait 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 alone, Yeah. So, any questions for me? I'm gonna look at the chat as well.
How'd you set up the pre-reverbs?
Yeah. So, basically, what I did for that was, um, oh, it's right here. So in Pro Tools, you make a copy of your track. You select the clip, then you go to Audio Suite, Reverb, whichever reverb you want. I use Deverb. Then you set your parameters. Make sure it's 100% wet so you can mix it in parallel later. Basically what you're doing, yeah. So basically what you're doing is you have your track, you have a copy of the track, you're making this track your reverb track, your pre-reverb track. So that's why it needs to be 100% wet. And then you press reverse. It should be on there. And then it just automatically makes that. And you can experiment with different times. It's really easy to do. Yeah. By the way, I used a 500 millisecond pre-reverb time. But as long as it's longer than 50 milliseconds, you'll overcome that pre-masking phenomenon.
Was there like any high-end roll-off on the reverb?
High end roll off? Yeah, I believe so. I think it was around like 13K. I think it just had a cut around just wherever the preset kind of puts you.
Gotcha. Would
Yeah.
you add in that high end in like the preverb part of the reverb? Man, would you add that back in if you wanted to like add more harmonic content to hopefully unmask it a bit more?
Yeah, you could definitely do that. I'd say um with plate reverbs, we're not looking for a super realistic sound. We're looking for something that is like making that content just last a little bit longer. So if it falls within like that frequency range that you want to make last a little bit longer, definitely experiment with different roll-offs or just like getting the roll-off out of the way completely. See how it sounds. It might be too distracting or it might not. Just depending on the mix, it might work or it might not. So yeah. Any other questions?
How are you so brilliant?
I studied this for 2 semesters. 2 semesters of studying this stuff. I read 100 pages of this book here. That's in the works cited. It's a very dense book, but very informative. It's actually not about music. It's about speech. So it's a psychoacoustics book. So a lot of the examples. It's where I got those graphs from earlier. It's like a lot of the examples don't necessarily take into account from 20 hertz to 20K. They only take into account the range of speech, but it's still very useful stuff.
What kinds of things should someone listen for to identify if masking is even happening at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, so basically, what you're listening for is you have to listen from a certain perspective of, let's say you have a lead vocal and you have a guitar, and you're listening for the intelligibility of the lead vocal. Can I understand the words that are being said? If I can't, odds are something in there is masking it. Maybe a good starting place would be, okay, what do you think is masking it? Solo that track with the vocal and see, okay, is this affecting it? Because sometimes I've been wrong about that. Oh, the bass is masking it. So I start EQing on the bass, not realizing that it's the guitar that's masking it. So definitely pinpoint that first and then go from there.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Yeah, of course.
And that applies to all types of masking, right?
Yeah, because basically these different ways of unmask, like there's different kinds of ways to unmask things. There's different types of masking, but ultimately what you're listening for is sort of a drop in intelligibility of the thing, of the maskee. You're listening for it being covered up in some way. That's kind of a general way to think of it, but that I think that's a good way to kind of quantify it, is like, is it being covered up in some way?
I'm just curious because like I think from what I've gathered, it sounds like, or at least from what I've noticed in your like in the audio examples, it sounds like temporal masking is a bit tougher to pinpoint. Like for me, I could probably mistake amplitude masking for temporal masking. Me being a percussionist,
Right.
I'm because like flams, maybe actually to someone that's not, as excellent in terms of their well-tuned internal clock, like I am. It seems like it'd be tough to discern whether or not, I mean, I guess you could literally look at whether or not it happens after or before. But like, I think as a percussionist, flamming, like that whole, oh man, that whole like side of rhythm, uh, it's just caused by delay, but not really like necessarily like pre-delay. We don't really think. I mean, we can think before, but everything leads into something. So like for me, it's just kind of hard to wrap my head around pre-delay. Long story short.
Yeah, I'd say for pre-delay, it's something that maybe, if you're not getting the results you want in other ways, maybe try it and see if that helps. Yeah, I agree with you though. It's really hard to pinpoint what type of masking is happening here. I think that's a really good point. Like, oh, like the snare is being masked by the guitar or something like that. Do I cut the frequency range of the guitar, or do I make the snare last longer? Both might work, but it depends on what you think sounds better as well. So it's also like, do I want to affect the guitar, or do I just want to affect the snare? Like, do I want the guitar to maintain its timbral integrity, I guess?
Actually, that's a really good point.
So you could do either way. I feel like a lot of these things are not just super cut and dry. You have to do this, you have to do that. Use them in conjunction with each other, I think, is a really good way to make sure you're unmasking. And again, just like use your ears. Trust your ears on this. It's really much more about, am I hearing what I want to hear? Like, am I hearing the intelligibility of the vocal, rather than, do these settings work? Like scientifically, do they work? Like, yes, that may be true, but it might not sound right. So definitely trust your ears. I always say that when it comes to mixing. Like, trust your ears, not your eyes. So hope that answers the question.
It does. I thought it was a really good point to bring up. Like, if you don't want to mess with the timbre of something, because usually when I unmask, it is with like either compression, reverb, uh, reverb more so now. Actually, because last semester you told me reverb is a good way to temporally unmask, which is brilliant. But I always go for compression, reverb, or EQ. So it's for me, it's tough to find, like, to figure out which one to apply.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm still having trouble with that, honestly. Um, and I think it comes with experience. I think it just comes with practice as well. Any other questions?
Oh, wait. Spoken like a true educator, to be honest.
Okay. I'm going to stop sharing. Yes, I was recording. Okay. Well, I'm going to check the chat real quick. Um, yeah, I wrote the lyrics. Um, I came up with them after like I spent a week just coming up with the lyrics and the melody and stuff like that. Um, and yeah. Okay, great. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you having interest in this subject. You know, like I do. I think it's a really cool subject. A lot of mixing in general is unmasking. So I think a lot of these techniques are very important to know. And that's why I wanted to do this directed study and this presentation is to teach people about it. So yeah, I'm gonna stop the recording now.